Oh, sorry, I should do it in English, shouldn't I? Okay, fine. So it's a great pleasure to talk to you again. Now is perhaps the more kind of entertaining talk and more business consequential talk. You've already heard me talk about science, so I don't need to press my first point, which is that although... that's too bad, it's a bit cut here. No, it's not too bad. My first point, which is that, so now I'm giving this on behalf of the SciPost Foundation, but really I want you to think of me as the professor at the University of Amsterdam, because that's what I am now, and that's what I'll keep being as well. I have not become a publisher. This is just a kind of extra thing that I do on the side, although it's becoming a relatively large-scale endeavor. So maybe I'd like to start by emphasizing that everything I do about publishing really is firmly anchored from the point of view of scientists. So I really want to, if you want to address the issues with publishing from the point of view of scientists. I really want this problem to be solved by scientists. I want the solutions to be implemented by scientists. I want the systems that solve the problem to be owned by scientists as well. So let's just start with some points of concern that you probably share. And this is really a very small selection of the possible points of concerns you might have. Accessibility, big problem. Sometimes you don't find what you need. The quality of the final product, of course, is something important. We don't want just junk. We want the topmost quality in our publications there. We all have funny anecdotes about refereeing. For me, one thing which is very important is this one. It's the freedom to author the science I do in an honest manner. I don't like having to, put loads of smoke and mirrors around things to underline the importance. I would much prefer to write my science precisely like I do it. That is, being quite objective and cool about it, going straight to the point, and write it for the people it's meant to help in their further work. Then there are, of course, very important problems related to people's personal lives and career and stuff. So impact assessment, how it's done, how it's misused. Call that the impact of the impact factor. Okay, so this is really a long story. The annoyances that you probably share come from different sources. Of course, each time you have to foot a certain bill to download your own PDF. That's really something that doesn't happen in many other industries. The refereeing, once again, is not always constructive or useful. Sometimes you feel that there's a great lack of editorial expertise that affects the decision on you. Sometimes your paper is selected for publication in there because some editor who doesn't understand anything of what you're talking about thinks it looks good and otherwise blocks it because there are too many mathematical equations or some nonsense like that. Okay, some non-scientific criteria. And for young people and for everybody, really, the journal title is sometimes more important. Well, actually, I shouldn't say sometimes. It's almost always more important than the actual content of your paper. Okay, so if you publish in a certain journal somewhere, it will have a huge impact. But if you publish, with 20 other people, that's not making any difference. If you have a single author in a more minor journal, then this is completely disregarded. So this is completely nonsensical. Actually, there have been many studies in there, and we always put the kind of evil side on the side of the publishers. But I think this is actually incorrect. And as an illustration of this, I want to quote in Dutch, I'm sorry, an interview of the editor-in-chief of Nature that was done by a journalist in the Netherlands about 2 years ago now. So Philip Campbell, the editor-in-chief of Nature, was addressing this question of the kind of influence of his journal on the careers of people. So that's the title here. The journal, the scientific journal that can break careers. And what he says is that Nature has become a substitute for serious quality assessment of researchers. The following phrase is quite funny. We find that unfortunate, because for us, it's the newsworthiness that counts. Okay, that comes first. We publish what's new and what's exciting. It must be good, but it is not, by definition, the best science. Okay? So I think you have to let the penny drop on that one. You might feel that these people are really evil and they're trying to do something, but really they're trying to sell magazines. And you can ask yourself, why is it that your career and your, indeed, personal lives is so affected by publishing in there or not? This is very much a self-made problem from the scientists themselves. Okay? So I think one has to cool and be very careful when discussing what we're fighting against. I think we're mostly fighting against ourselves. So, there have been many discussions about open access in the last 15 years. I mean, it started with some declarations that were made in the early 2000s. You can even trace it much before that. These are really the big political statements that were made. This is ongoing. There was a huge call for action in 2016, Bill de Jussieu here in France in 2017. Very recently, 11, now 12 and more nations have signed over Plan S, which is really meant to show a pathway to open access by 2020, although this is already being delayed a little bit. So my personal perspective on all of this is that it's all extremely good. I'm very happy that political circles and decisional instances are really focusing attention on this. But let's be honest, the details are not good. There are many things missing. For me, the most important thing is the question of the implementation. There are loads of positionings, declarations of intention here, but they haven't thought about actually running the solution for these things. They haven't really taken scientists' views enough into account as far as I'm concerned. They haven't started implementing correct incentives for all this transition to occur. Okay, so I was really talking about this quite a lot from the last few years. And at some point, my colleagues were getting increasingly irritated with me going on about this all the time, so they told me, JS, either you shut up or you do something about it. So then I don't like shutting up, so I did something about it, which is now taking the form of this SciPost system. So the idea of SciPost is quite simple. It's a full publishing portal. It does everything you need as far as publishing is concerned. We do use the archive for the preprints, but that's mostly to guarantee that people will have seen the material that is subjected to peer refereeing. You have to view SciPost as a complete, professional system that is meant to replace and deprecate existing infrastructure from other publishers. The idea is that it is run exclusively by professionally active scientists, and it will remain like this. What does it offer? Well, primarily we have scientific journals, currently in the field of physics. But we also offer a layer where you can comment on any existing literature out there. You can get citable comments on these things if you want. And there are also projects to create an international database of theses and things like that. But I'll focus on the journals today. So if you want a two-word summary of the whole idea behind it, is that we leverage openness to achieve quality. We believe that openness leads to higher quality in scientific publishing, leads to a more mature scientific debate and refereeing process, and so we want to apply that to what we do. So what do we aim to achieve? Again, this is simple to state. Everything having to do with scientific publishing, we want to change, or at least improve. That means that we want to implement, if you want, a complete form of open access, which I call the genuine open access. You can look at my website, I'll show you definitions of this later as well. So, of course, accessibility for readers is total and unquestioned, but also the authors, we don't want to bother with any of the financial shenanigans associated to the new systems based, for example, on APCs and things like that. We want to decouple all scientific and financial issues. Okay, so we want scientists not to be bothered by these operational things. We want to really remove this design flaw of the article processing charge-based system, that there's this kind of publish to cash in problem in there that led to the propagation of all these predatory open access journals. In fact, this system has led to greatly increased profits from publishers since its inception. Importantly also, we want to modernize the refereeing procedure. We want to make it more open. So the reports that you write for SciPost are actually put on the open. You can remain anonymous as a referee, but the contents of your report will be open. That allows us to give more credit to referees because the reports themselves become citable objects. I'll give more details about that. We want also to streamline this post-publication feedback, make it much easier to add content to existing publications, make it feel much more like a scientific publication is not a kind of death knell for a certain project. It's actually part of an ongoing process which is not necessarily terminated at the moment of publication. And finally, and this is really something that we're quite busy with in the background, we want to reform impact assessment. We want to change metrics, we want to change the way that they're done, we want to change the tools that they're done with. We want to change the way institutions go about using these things in there. Okay? So, I mean, this is the list of these genuine open access principles. If you want a very simple version of it, is that we want this thing to be community run, we want this thing to be completely non-profit, we want this thing to be completely open in all respects. For example, all the finances that we have in our organization, it's all completely open, we made citations open, etc. Okay, but you can look at these things and see how it goes. So maybe a couple of words about SciPost itself. So SciPost is legally constituted from a not-for-profit foundation in the Netherlands. Then we have an advisory board. At the moment, a dozen preeminent physicists are sitting in there. The kind of kernel of the whole operation is what we call the editorial college. So the editorial college is the collection of professional academics of a rather senior level that take all the editorial decisions. So they run the refereeing processes, they formulate recommendations on papers, and they take decisions. Okay, so at the moment we have 64, 65 people in there. We want to scale it up to about 200 for now, but there is no upper limit. The limit is, or the number, the size of the editorial college is associated to the size of the workflow that we have to deal with. Of course, then we've got a team in there, so this is like my dream team, because that would mean that I'm not doing all the work myself. At the moment, we have one person which is employed full-time, so I'm doing most of the development work myself with one of my students, and then support also we do here. But eventually, we'll have a whole executive team here doing the day-to-day running of the work. Very importantly, I'll tell you more later about our financial model. We have a bunch of sponsors, academic institutions that benefit from our activities, that give us donations with which we run the whole infrastructure. Okay, maybe to explain to you the flow chart for submissions at SciPost, how it works. The idea is that the authors send us their manuscripts, and at some point, so when all the plagiarism checks have been passed, we expose this manuscript to the editorial college and invite a number of fellows to take charge of the submission. A submission really has to be actively taken charge of by one of the fellows. If the submission fails to attract interest of all our fellows, then it's not processed further. Once a fellow takes charge, we open a public page, submission page for that particular thing, and the editor in charge invites a number of professionals to actively referee this paper, just like in normal systems. But in addition, if you're a registered contributor to SciPost, for which you have to be at least a PhD student level in the field, if you're registered with us, and we've verified your identity, you're actually able to contribute reports to submissions under consideration. So that is, if you see a manuscript on which you happen to know something, and you know that equation 32 is incorrect, you're welcome to submit a report on it before the decision is taken. Okay, so that's a huge difference, because the pool of available resources for quality evaluation is essentially, orders of magnitude larger than by traditional closed-door editorial processes. So once the refereeing round is finished, the fellow in charge formulates an editorial recommendation. This is also an extremely important point here. The fellow in charge does not take a decision, merely formulates a recommendation. All decisions are taken communally by the editorial college. So there are multiple layers of verification to make sure that there's no ganging up and things like that. So it's an extremely hard process to go through. And that's what we mean when we say that we use openness to leverage for quality, because you see it here, by opening it up a bit as compared to closed-door refereeing, there are way fewer ways where abuse can be put in there. So that's the way it goes. What you should know is that really all the operations that we associate to this are really fully professional. So it's not just an overlay journal or anything like that. No, it's a full publishing entity in there. Our flagship journal, SciPost Physics, is indexed in the engines. So I've already told you, no APCs. You preserve copyright as an author. All the things are linked with traditional metadata engines. Your funders are going to know about your publications if you acknowledge them, etc., etc. Okay, so we do all this professional metadata treatment associated to this. So you see it there. Just go to scipost.org, and then you'll see how that all works. Okay, so this is front page of the site from a couple of days ago. So like I said, at the moment we're running in physics. So we're listed in Google Scholar, you'll find the publications there. Web of Science, you'll find the publications there. We actually obtained also the seal from the Directory of Open Access Journals. So this is in recognition of the kind of degree of openness that you have, and we're also listed in there. But now, I have a few minutes, and I want to talk about the business side of things, because I think it's important that you're conscious of these things. So, just to have a little bit of fun, 1 minute, I want to emphasize I love markets. I'm from Quebec, I'm from North America, I'm used to kind of capitalist thinking and things like that, and markets work very well, that's great. And I have a modest proposal for markets in scientific publishing. So this was a little blog post that I put in honor of Jonathan Swift's 350th birthday. And you might know his proposals about solving famine in Ireland, but anyway, this is based on a variation of that. So, to start with the simplest and most obvious point, I'd expect to be paid at least my professional hourly rate to perform refereeing duties. But, if I push that a little further, if I feel that I'm actually doing a better work than my colleagues of it, I would charge more. And why not? Right? Let's make it a market. Then, as an author, I'd expect actually to be approached by the publishing venues with offers for how much they would pay me to publish my research in their journals. So I could consider competing offers and perhaps systematically go for the highest bidder here. So instead of paying to publish somewhere, I would expect to be paid for them to have the honor of putting the fruits of my years of labor and my group's years of labors into this. Coming to think of it, I would never actually agree to sell my work to a publisher. I would just lease it on a yearly basis. And for the particularly successful papers, at the end of the year, I would renegotiate the contract. And if the payment is not big enough, I would just move to another venue. And then, coming to think of it as well, I'm not kind of stupid. I would just, so this is the rental market. But one step beyond, I would say also, hang on. We love markets, we love capitalism and things. So let me start a numbered company in which I'll put all these profits, and I'll just make sure I put all the proceeds in a tax haven somewhere. And once I've reached that point, it's great because my children and things can profit from my labor, and I can finally feel completely at ease with my corporate colleagues, because that's what they do. Okay? So, I love markets, it's great, that's a system that we could go for. But the other option is that we don't use any markets, and you can choose whatever you prefer, but then that's why I kind of feel to you perhaps a little bit socialist in thinking. I want it completely the other way around. I don't believe markets work here. It's not a market, so there is no market. Let's not even try to pretend there's one. Scientific publishing is not something that's appropriate for a marketplace. So, to classify business models of publishers, I developed a kind of metallurgic way of doing it. Gold, platinum, palladium, so depending on the type of business that you have, all these are good. But the kind of more normal ones are either iron, where you've got some subscription-based financing, or lead, when you essentially mix editorial and financial aspects. So most publishers you're dealing with today have much lead poisoning. I think this is something to be avoided at all costs. Okay, also you can do different gradations of how open they are, so there's this carat classification. Anyway, if you just look at my website, you'll see these descriptors. So, I can tell you where I think a particular publisher fits in this categorization. So what's our model then? Our model is actually completely different. We are essentially relying on a community-based model. It's a little bit like the archive. The archive relies on donations from institutions worldwide, without actually counting essentially a certain number of bucks per downloads of PDFs per particular institutions. It makes for an extremely lean and mean system that's much cheaper for everybody. In terms of publishers, there's an example of the Open Library of the Humanities that also works according to this principle. So the idea is that we've got sponsors that are formed by academic institutions, again, taking benefits from our activities. I would just ask them to give us some running funds for this. Current estimate is that we can run a fully sustainable operation on a baseline of about 400 euros per paper. Okay, so this is just an estimate because paper is not a proper unit. Some papers are very simple, some papers are very complicated. But summed over and averaged over large-scale operations, this is what we're aiming for. So this is about a quarter of the announced minimal costs that publishers can get away with. We've got a number of sponsors that have already signed. We've signed a number of collaboration agreements with big things. So for example, with CERN, we have an active collaboration agreement. We received funding from Open Air, and we've got some support also from the Max Planck Gesellschaft. Also the Austrians have recently agreed to support us. The Dutch University Associations have also given us some things. So our immediate challenges are as follows, and I'll take just one more minute to finish. So we want to increase awareness, okay? So we really want you scientists to understand what's in there. There are some factors that are limiting our growth. Two of them are immobility of existing metrics, and also, one point which I really want to emphasize, lack of and incorrect awareness from the part of scientists. Okay? I don't think most scientists understand the business of publishing at all. I think this is a great problem. So we need more sponsors. We want to argue that it's the cheapest integrated solution, and the slowness of this. But we have plans to open journals in other fields once we have enough support. And then, the follow-up battle is going to be about metrics and citations, but maybe I'll leave that for a private discussion. There are also other developments, so it's very difficult to get actual support from various big organizations that do benefit immensely from our activities. So these are difficult negotiations that are going through there. Again, you can read about my own position on these things on my blog post. There's also an article that I wrote recently for Europhysics News that you can find about reforming this business of scientific publishing. So in conclusion, I just want to maybe tell you a little bit what I think you should do. If you're a scientist, well, please don't just stand there, okay? You actively have to shift to publishing in open science. Anyway, you're getting more and more mandates from your funders in order to do that. But I think you shouldn't do that because you're mandated. You should do that because you understand the importance of going open in science. And please educate yourselves. Be aware of what you're doing and who you are dealing with. I think most people don't understand that at all. If you're working for free for-profit publishers, you can actually consider stopping and offering your services to not-for-profits instead, or maybe in addition to what you're doing. Some examples, some editors are kind of seeing the light at some point and stepping down and then singing the praises of our thing, which is great. We're looking for many more of those. If you're from institutions and funders, mandates have to be updated, evaluation criteria as well. And then also, I think negotiations with professional publishers could really be handled in a much more, productive way for the academic institutions. But anyway, this is a complicated thing. Politicians, governments also have some roles here. This is another detail about some recent developments in law for copyright. I'll leave that aside. And how can you help? Well, shifting to us would make a big difference because it increases our scale and it increases then our kind of footprint and ability to push things through. Do read and be aware, and if you're using them, cite the publications we have. Do participate in our open refereeing process because I do think it's a pretty productive thing. If you know people who might be productive editorial fellows for us, do tell us. And encourage your local institutions to become sponsors for us. That's going to make a big difference. And I leave you with the wise words of Gimli from the movie. You'll remember, yeah? So, certainty of death, small chance of success. Well, what are we waiting for? That's the question. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot to Jean-Sébastien for this very nice talk. Any question on the two talks? I'm sure there are plenty of questions.
Yeah, I do have a few questions, but before that, some comments. And some of them, especially to Jean-Sébastien, may sound a bit negative, but I think it's important. I mean, it's an important subject to think about, and it's important to try initiatives, even if I'm going to sound skeptical about some aspects. So, going back to Delphine's talk, the then one of the reasons that our fees are relatively low is that, as far as I'm aware, most of us publish in basically professional society journals, which are relatively inexpensive to subscribe to and essentially free to publishing, things like Physical Review, JHEP.
It is not free to publishing. It's an incorrect word. It's just that you don't pay it, but your institution pays it through the back door.
There's a subscription, but it's not on the scale of
Do you know what it is?
Professional publishers. Well,
Do you actually know what it is?
Actually, I don't know what the institution.
I challenge your last statement. If you say that it's not as much as the other publishers, I invite you to actually look at the numbers.
Well, tell me what the numbers are then.
It depends on which ones you want to know.
Fine. Compare Elsevier with Physical Review D.
It depends on the journal
Well,
within Elsevier.
if there's one information you can have, and to make the comparison is, Scope 3, the system into which the international community for high energy physics around the CERN is actually having some sort of contract with 3 or 4 editors now.
It's more than that.
Well, it's about 10 reviews, and APS came into the system last year, and there's a sort of an average price for every publication, which is 800 euros to 1,000 euros.
It's more than that.
And for APS, it's 2,000 euros.
Correct.
Though they are actually costing literally double than the others.
So Hindawi charges 800.
They charge for their fame. I mean, they charge for the privilege of being published in APS.
Hindawi 800. Elsevier journals 1,100. APS 2,000.
This is per article you're claiming?
Yes.
Okay, this is the open access version. But that's not what most of us.
APS does double dipping. They still charge subscription
Yes.
fees, and they charge you open access fees on top of that.
Very few people, I think, at IPHT do the open access fees, because that was another point I'm going to come to, is that if there's a question. I'm not a great believer in these open access models anyway, but if that's the way the political stratum wants people to move, they have to provide resources for that.
That's correct, and that's why they have mandates, and they have conditions now associated to ERC grants and things like that, where you do have to publish gold, and green is not going to be enough.
Well, green is not exactly a way of publishing. Green is a way of preserving in the long term information. You can't really compare that. But the idea is find a way to make your publication or the scientific information accessible as quickly and as widely as possible. That's the real mandate.
Anyway, so to move on to some of my comments, then the how and this open air thing, I think it's precisely an illustration of what I commented earlier, that you're reproducing, especially with HAL, some Franco-French thing which does not actually have any utility to people even here beyond the archive, and it certainly has no utility to people outside France from that point of view. And it's not free. It costs people time, it costs money to the institutions. That's money that without necessarily endorsing SciPost would be much better put into SciPost, because at least it's trying something different and something global. There's a number of detailed things that maybe you can answer based on existing experience in terms of essentially workload for referees, in terms of the additional workload for authors when there's all these crowdsourced referee reports. So do you have any comments about that, Jean-Sébastien?
Well, I'll pass it to you. But first, once again, you can't compare SciPost to open air. It has nothing to do. And you also have to think of the fact that in research you have the scientists, you researchers, but you also have a whole lot of people working around you to help you to do your research. And those people, those institutions, and they have to deal with politicians who are those who are giving you money. And we are accountable to them. We are accountable to our ministries and to the people who are giving us the money to do research. And for those people, it may seem absurd to you, but it's normal that there is a long-term preservation into institutional repositories as open-air or are.
I don't see any value in those things beyond making a mirror of the archive. If you're worried that a meteorite is going to hit Cornell and vaporize Paul Ginsberg into Kingdom Come, then...
It takes time, but you can get organized, and people like Emmanuel can help you a lot with that.
It doesn't do me any good, it doesn't do my colleagues any good, and it doesn't do my readers any good. It's une usine à gaz, to use the French term. And the resources that are getting put into those, you can take this as feedback.
But the resources we put into those are very few compared to what we actually pay in the usual system.
So what? We're trying to shift to a new system, so at least let's try and do something constructive instead of just having our own little Franco-French version of something that already exists and works.
Of course, fragmentation is not a good thing. I think that's the point you're making. However, you have to realize that, so I'm not from HAL, I have a completely disinterested view in HAL, and I see two things about it which are, in a sense, useful. So first of all, unlike the archive, it's not specialized to a single field. Second, the content that you can put on HAL is very much broader than what you can put on the archive. The archive is not an archiving system for everything. It's a preprint server. So when you see initiatives coming out like HAL that are at national level, and you look at the way they couple cross-nationally to other initiatives, I think maybe your criticism would be a little bit milder. I think what's emerging now is that there are loads of local initiatives that are working more and more together. It's also the purpose of Open Air, that are synchronizing with each other, and that will provide a kind of large-scale solution. And this has not converged yet. If you think, for example, of just data, I think the development of Zenodo, it's also possible to criticize it geographically. Yes, it's more of a European thing, if you want, but actually it's accessible to anybody. And it's going to be very centralized. So I think this is the future. And this is for data sets, so you can put units of 20